thank you very much, Lois. I'm really happy to be here. As Lois said, it's kind of a surprise. Victor and I have been trying all summer to figure out a time where I could come. I'm actually Victor Chung's PhD supervisor, former PhD supervisor. So I'm really happy to be here, but I also have other connections at Carleton. I worked with Robert Biddle on a previous NSERC strategic network called SurfNet. And I know Sonia Chejean through the HCI community and Audrey through the HCI community as well. So I'm really happy to be here and meet all of you and get you up to speed on what I've been doing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what Victor was doing while he was my student. And I'm also going to talk, for most of you, anyone who knows me knows the surface computing side of what I have done. You might not know the details, but that's what I'm known for. I recently, after 9 years at the University of Waterloo, have moved to the University of Guelph. So I'm now a professor in computer science there. And if you don't know what the University of Guelph is like, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later, but it has its roots in agriculture. And it has the Ontario Veterinary College, so there's lots of animals on campus. And that was a huge opportunity for me to start a new research program. So I'm going to talk about that at the very end and talk about how I've gone from supporting people to moving towards supporting animals and their handlers in a farm context. So I'm going to frame my discussion today around Mark Weiser's vision of ubiquitous computing, which is near 30 years old now. And he had this notion that technologies are going to disappear into the everyday fabric of our lives, and that has largely come to pass. Many of the things that he envisioned 30 years ago, he envisioned tablets and smartphones and connected devices and large displays. They exist and we use them, some more or less, depending on his vision. But he also imagined a world where everything was interconnected. So there was lots of networked and wireless, wired and wired networked wireless things, computing devices interacting. So we had this notion, I think he called pads what we would call tablets now, and his word was tabs for what we would call a smartphone. So we've used slightly different terminology. But this was a paper from, it's cut off, sorry, 91. So he really was visionary, and he inspired many, many people to move in this direction, and his vision has largely come to pass. If you read his paper, a lot of the things he's talking about, these early systems that he was working on at Xerox PARC, large displays, and these were really clunky looking tablets and things like that, but many of us have them or know people that have them. So it's very interesting to think about that vision and how far we've gotten, or maybe how far we have to go in that vision. It inspired a whole generation of people working towards that vision, working on interactive furniture, interactive large displays, and digital spaces, so these connected spaces that didn't exist when he had that vision. And this really inspired me from my PhD and into my early faculty work, thinking about how you actually create this vision, how you make technologies that actually work for the people that are trying to use them in this space. One of the things that was kicked around a lot at the beginning, particularly for large displays, tabletop displays, wall displays, was what's the killer app? Everybody wanted that killer app for these technologies, and there was a lot of doubt around the technologies. But the reality was, because most of the time for large displays, connected devices, walk up and use technologies, they're convenient for personal use, but we mostly work without them. Nowadays we're probably, maybe not so much the connected devices, but on your average workday, you're probably not using large displays. You're probably not using a walk up and use technology. You might be using multiple technologies. They may or may not be connected together, but they're probably wirelessly connected to some other computer somewhere else in the world. But for group collaboration in a face-to-face context, these technologies can really be enabling. They can allow people to do things that they can't do otherwise. Particularly large displays like this or tabletop displays, people can sit around and access their digital data. They can pass information back and forth. They can brainstorm and communicate around this information. But besides the connectivity and the technical challenges, it turned out this is actually really hard to make computers that support real collaboration, because it's really messy. The things we do when we collaborate tend to be very, very messy. And people are pretty good getting by without technology, but it ends up being a lot of after work. They'll collaborate in a face-to-face environment, and then they go back to their personal computers, and they do a lot of the work that catches them up to what they were doing in the face-to-face context. So we really were inspired to make computers that better address this issue in particular. So that really motivated a lot of my early work. I want to give a shout out to all the students and staff that have worked with me over the years, because as any professor knows, you don't do this alone. All the research that I'm going to talk about, everybody else did it, and I happen to be very lucky to work with all these great people. So I wanted to shout out to my team. I really tried to recruit an interdisciplinary team, and hopefully many of you here at Carleton involved in the interdisciplinary programs here can appreciate that. Collaboration is a hard problem. These interconnectivity and making technology fit into everyday patterns and workflows is very hard. You need people coming at it from lots of different perspectives, so I recruited people from computer science, engineering, and various disciplines within engineering. People in my team had psychological backgrounds, biological backgrounds, coming from management science, graphical design, etc. So all of these different backgrounds bring different perspective and brought a lot of value to the work we did. And just a note, I think I mentioned this at the beginning. So most of these students and staff work with me at Waterloo. I was at Waterloo for 9 years, and I've been at the University of Guelph now for just coming up to 1 year. So some of these three down here work with me at Waterloo, but everybody else is, or sorry, at Guelph, everyone else was at Waterloo. So the earliest research that I was working on towards this vision of supporting collaboration revolved around tabletop collaborative workspaces. So I was very interested in providing people a large, shared, equal opportunity workspace where there was a lot of research, even back when I started my PhD many moons ago, that said that at a large wall display like this, there was usually one driver and other passengers along the way in the collaboration, and anyone who had if you take the classic whiteboard, anyone who had the marker had a little more control than everybody else. And there was, from observational studies, evidence coming about the tabletops were a more equitable workspace. There was not necessarily as much power dynamics in the collaboration. So I was very interested in that as a workspace. But it's actually really hard to provide a software interface for a display that has no up. So every vertical display has a top and a bottom. If you sit around a table, people can approach it from different sides. So you have people coming at it from different sides, there's different viewing angles, so orientation and actually creating a software interface that acknowledges this somehow, that allows people to rotate things and orient things in an appropriate way when you invoke something in the interface was very important. Other issues that would come up in terms of the usability of designing these displays was in certain contexts, and at the time I was working with the Defense Department, and they were interested in what if people had different authority or they had different roles. And in the interface, they wanted access to different information, whether they had the authority to do, or it just suited their role better and the tasks they were doing. And most tabletop technologies at the time, and even still today, most touch-based tabletop technologies don't distinguish between users. So we were using a pen-based technology at the time that happened to allow you to distinguish between pens. So we equated that to, if this was your pen, that was your identity. And then we were able to do things like tailoring the user menus, both in terms of what orientation the menu might come up at on the table and information. So some menus might come up and it would gray out some of the system details you might not have authority to do, or it didn't suit your role. So those were some of the types of user experimenting we were doing at the time. Unfortunately, even though this was a great technology, it's one of those great technologies that never really took off, so we don't really see these kind of displays anymore. It was based on the Enoto pen technology, which allowed this user pen distinction, and there was issues with the company that technology was never really made accessible to researchers or commercially, unfortunately. So most tables today, you could not do this without some other way beside, you might have to do fingerprint detection, which is a more modern method of user distinction. Another issue that comes up when you're sharing a large display, even though it's large, you can still run out of screen real estate, and you're sharing that screen real estate. So in a collaboration I did with Nick Graham's group at Queen's University, we were looking at a display that allowed people to bring up different lenses, and then you could zoom into particular areas for different people working on different spaces. So that's some of the research we did related to, again, how do we work together on the same shared space, but the software recognizes there's different distinct people with different needs and different desires for accessing information at that time. Once we started getting some of the basics of just sharing and display down, really we saw in the whole community around interactive tables that the orientation issue became basically solved. Everybody allowed people to freely rotate things. That became a default functionality that every tabletop started to have. We wanted then to move beyond, it was very common at the time for all these demo interaction techniques to be basically photo manipulation. And we really wanted to move beyond just manipulating really simple kinds of data. So we started looking at tasks, collaborative tasks that involved more complex data, sometimes dynamic data as well. And so in this example, this is an example we did, collaboration we did with Michael Haller's group in Austria. They were working with a local police organization that had large wall display, and then they had geo-tracked or GPS-tracked police vehicles out in the city, and they wanted to be able to keep track and manage their fleet. But if you had the whole map showing and you really wanted to look at one particular area, you could use a lens and you could blow that up. But if your cars are moving in real world, soon they're going to start going out of your view if you have this view. So we worked on a different visualization to basically follow it outside the view. The technique we used was called Canyon, and it had a little fold in here, and the visual distinction of the fold started to show you how far away that vehicle had moved from the particular the view, or that it had changed direction in this case. So you could sort of get a sense geographically where it was still in the city, while not expanding your view so other people could also be using that display at the same time. We also worked on tabletop systems where using games as this application context for demonstration, we started looking at converting existing digital or tabletop, like traditional cardboard board games, and converting them into a digital tabletop game. The particular games we were looking at were simulation style cooperative games. So things would happen, events would happen that we could automate in our game environment. But if you have a cooperative game where people are interacting in the system and on the workspace, and the game itself is changing the state, you can very quickly get confused as to what the state of the game is, and you'll lose both your competitive edge as a team, because this is a cooperative game, and it just becomes very confusing and overwhelming for the users. So my PhD student, Betty Chang, started working on an interface that was an interactive timeline. So this timeline was designed specifically for this game. If you're familiar with the game, it was called Pandemic. It's a kind of game that an epidemic starts to spread around the world unless you start to do the right actions against it. And this timeline allowed each of the player to explore what actions, like the historical actions other players had made, and the automation had made in the game. And although we did this in a gaming context, we were really interested in the general concept of this historical browsing, or being able to browse and interact with historical data for other kinds of contexts, like military command and control, which I was also working on at the time. So we did a project where we did a mock-up of this kind of timeline in a real naval environment, well, a mock, but for the ideas that they could explore it for a potentially real naval environment. This timeline allowed people to both just visually look at what had happened, but if they started to interact with the different events on the timeline, those events would replay onto the shared workspace. So a user could explore the historical state of the game themselves, but that was also cooperative. That was a cooperative tool for them to be able to discuss what had happened, what new event the game had thrown at them in that context. More and more, as we worked around tables, I talked about the fact that you can quickly run out of space, real estate, screen real estate on one shared display. There were, in the rest of the community, huge uptake of mobile devices. Everybody was carrying on a cell phone and a tablet, and there was a lot of interest in being able to use these personal devices while you're using these large displays as well. So we started looking at other kinds of more connected device types of spaces where we had personal devices being available to collaborators at the same time that they were using a shared display as well. And we started to look at some of the key usability issues. So a big issue that happens now, you have private displays and shared, large shared displays, is keeping track of who's doing what on what spaces in these different workspaces. So we started designing a lot more awareness, typically types of awareness visualizations and displays and interfaces that you would see in distributed collaboration. We started thinking about these environments as local distributed type of computers. They weren't quite completely remote. They didn't quite need all of the bells and whistles and interventions that you would put into a distributed collaboration system, because people could still talk and get all the benefits of being face-to-face. So you didn't need the communication tools that a distributed collaboration system would give you, but it needed all the same awareness tools. So we started building in awareness tools into these systems. Another big issue that came up was if you have one small device here and you've got a large device here, in certain contexts, you're going to want to be able to move content from one device to another. And how do you do that? How do you make that a very seamless kind of activity? So we worked on different kind of cross-device transfer, and I'll show a video of that system that we developed. We called Surface Ghosts. And more recently, we've been working on the challenge when you have, say, a collaborative data analysis environment, and you might have a large data set on your shared display, but then you want to do some kind of break away from the group, and you want to do some personal data browsing yourself and thinking about the problem and exploring the data. You might go off in a different direction than your collaborators, but the data between these devices are connected. So you may show the whole data set or the data space on the large display, and you maybe just be looking at a piece of that. And cognitively, that can be very challenging for people to understand how the data space is connected, how they control what they're seeing on their personal device, and how that relates to what everyone's seeing on the large display. And also coming back to the awareness issue, if you're in a collaborative data analysis task and you've dove into one aspect of the task, how does your partner know what you're working on and how much progress you've made? So there's awareness, need for awareness displays in that space as well. So we were working on just early efforts towards being able to do a collaborative data analysis task where here on the tablet you would see a personal view. And the system allowed you to basically move a selection box around the larger data set to do a really quick overview of more of the detailed views that you could get if you blew something up. And if you blew up some data on, say, a map and you wanted to look at images related to a geographical space, if you did that on the table, you would quickly fill up the whole table. So what we allowed people to do was open the associated geographic or geotagged information related to a big map onto their personal views. And we looked at different interaction techniques for moving where your view was at the time. So that was a project that a master's student who recently graduated finished. So I wanted to show you, unfortunately there's no like sound connection here, so this is just going to be a video without sound, but this shows some of the dynamics of the cross-device transfer work that we were working on. Get to play, whoops. So what you're seeing here is that the user has picked up something from the table and they wanted to put it onto the tablet. And while it's in their hand, it's showing like a ghost view of the data on the table. So in order to do that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later as well, we needed to track the arm from above. So we had to connect above the table, and it was tracking where the user's arm was to be able to send the computer the location information of the arm and the outline of the arm. That's how we, some of the technical details of how we did that. So now I'm going to jump to some more recent work we've been doing, and in fact actually this is directly related to Victor Chung's PhD research. In fact, this image is from his study. We started becoming very interested in large displays in other contexts, not getting outside of the typical classroom or boardroom or work meeting room, and thinking about how displays are being used in a public setting. And we had been reading and sort of following other people interested in this, and there was a lot of reports, probably, when did you start? I guess probably like 5 years ago. Some of these maybe even 8 years ago now, reports from observational studies saying that digital tabletops are being deployed, digital walls are being deployed, and they had terrible usage rates. Companies would spend hundreds, thousands of dollars making these displays. They would deploy them and nobody would use them, or very, very few people would use them. On the order of 5% of passersby would engage. And by engage, I mean stop and maybe stay a few seconds. And maybe, if you're lucky, they will actually do something meaningful that the designer intended them to do. So this was a real challenge for both companies spending the money, museums who really wanted to use this technology, they wanted to engage people. And the observational studies were showing that people were confused, they didn't know what to do. There were definitely issues around social embarrassment. Like there was definite differences between, based on other people's work and our own studies, of groups were much more willing and are much more willing to interact with the display. An individual adult in the Western culture, that's where we get the 5% comes from. Maybe less than 5% will stop and use the display. There's huge concerns around social embarrassment or breaking the display or just all these anxieties that prevent people from stopping at all, even like looking like they're interested, and then if they're brave enough to stop, to actually try to do something in front of the display. So it was a real issue, and it is still a real issue. We're still like, today, a study we literally just ran a few weeks ago had these numbers. This study was run in an engineering school with early adopters of technology, and we still see this social embarrassment. I don't think that's the only problem, but there's definitely still this issue. So we were trying to figure out, how do you design these displays to attract and engage? So we ran a series of studies. The earliest work we did was in 2012, where we deployed a very cute kind of toy-looking table to a children's museum, and we were looking at, once people approached the display, how do they figure out how to use it? So we looked at different visual effects for them to find the menu. At this time there was a menu. You could play different stories from Aesop's fables. And so we looked at different visual effects, like, for instance, the menu peeking out of the side to kind of draw your attention there, and then you could touch near the side and it would come out. There were different animation effects to draw your attention to that area. And the peeking out was the most effective in terms of people finding that, that particular functionality. But that, being able to show them how to make the thing work, you still have to get them there first. So with Victor's work, and then the series of studies we've been doing since his work, we've been looking at just attracting people. So do people even notice the display? And then once they're in front of the display, how do you get them up and actually using the display? So the particular approach we've been looking at in a series of studies is using what's called proximity-based interaction, or proxemics interaction, if you're familiar with that terminology, where based on the user's distance to the display, you show different kinds of visual feedback. And so in Victor's work and Mojgan Ger's work, a master's student who just finished, they used a 3-zone interaction space, where in zone 1 there'd be one kind of visual effect. Zone 2, you'd show a different one. Zone 1, as they're approaching, you're showing something else. And it could be related. So in Victor's case, for instance, one of the visual effects he was showing was he had images floating around the display. Just kind of, that in itself is a common way to attract people's attention, just that consistent animation. Drawing on some results from the psychology, we started looking at adaptive speed changes. So basically, if someone crosses a zonal boundary, you get a change in the speed of how fast those things are animating. And that's been shown in psychology to draw your attention to something, and we're really good at seeing that out of our peripheral vision. But what we are trying to do is, as they approach, the content would get slower and slower and slower. And the idea would be that you don't want to be chasing it around to interact with it. Eventually, once you're in front of it, it's slow enough for you to actually engage with it. That was the design notion behind it. He also looked at silhouettes or user shadows. So as somebody approached the display, the shadow that was being shown, there was a Kinect mounted above, so it was tracking them and getting their silhouette. It would become more and more salient as somebody approached the display. So it was basically responding to the user as they were engaging. Mojgan did something a little bit different. So she didn't use the notion of shadow, but she did use the notion of these zones. And she showed different visual effects as people got closer. So for instance, her display was a big bookshelf, and you can click on a book to find out information about the different parts of the university. And so she would use animations like, as somebody, I think this was from zone 3 to zone 2, a book would just open. So it would kind of say, this, if you did something, it could open. If you moved closer, there'd be a little hand that would come out and touch, like showing you that kind of touch action to invite you to touch. So she was looking at these different feedback mechanisms. The other thing she had in the outer zone, as you crossed the display like this, the books would tilt. So they would follow you, and then if you backed up, they would follow you the other way, and we had people playing with that. But that was in the outer zone. So just to get you attention as you're walking by this display. So we're still, even though Mojgan's done, we're still trying to understand all the data she's collected. But so far, her stats are showing that this notion of user tracking and mirroring. So Victor was using this notion of mirroring in silhouettes, and Moshka was using this notion of mirroring in the tilting of the books as they follow you. One of the things we're noticing is that as someone's walking by, if you're mirroring them almost precisely, if they're walking in parallel, that effect is almost too far behind them. So depending on where they're looking in the public space, they may miss that. What we found in Moshkan's study was we had one condition where they were randomly, these animations were randomly happening, and that was more effective, and we think partly it was more effective at attracting people, and we think that's partly because there was more opportunity for them to see it. As they're walking, if it's happening over here, that may draw their attention more than a mirroring that would be happening just exactly perpendicular to them, or which may be outside their visual space. So we're still kind of exploring the utility of some of these effects. And where we're going to go from here, I'm not quite sure. But it's a really interesting project. So I did mention when I showed the video of the surface ghost, or the arm shadow that was played in the cross-device transfer work, that we did that using a connect above. And all the proximity-based interactions we were exploring as well. We had to use some kind of tracking device. So we've basically used connect in a lot of our work because it's a cheap off-the-shelf tracker, and it's easily deployed. It's very hard to set up a Vicon system in a public space, for instance, and it's prohibitively expensive. So we're finding that in order to get these smart spaces, you need to do a lot more tracking. You need a lot more sensors in the environment to make your computers smarter and respond to you in hopefully an appropriate way if you do your design correctly. Another project we did was actually looking at, as someone approached the display or approached a tabletop display, could you actually identify them using facial recognition? We're trying to get that going beyond user distinction, but to user identification. And that was for a military application where they wanted the system to basically log them in an authentic way. But we needed to do a lot more tracking in these spaces. And this is going to become important when I start talking about the farm work that I'm interested in doing. So just remember that you have to do a lot more tracking now. This is probably not news to most of you. Okay, so I'm going to cut to a different topic now. As I mentioned, last year I joined the University of Guelph. This is what the entrance sign looks like. This is our now famous griffin. Everyone loves the griffin, although he's actually very new. It's a very new sculpture. As I came to Guelph, I'm still interested in surface computing, but as most mid-career academics start to think, you might think a little bit about new directions. And coming to Guelph for me was a huge opportunity to follow a completely new direction in an area I'm very passionate about. So if you've never been to campus, this is what a typical day on campus in some parts, as my office does not look like this. It looks like a regular office. However, I park right beside these horses. I walk along a path called the cow path. By the dairy barn, I get to see cows. I don't see the pigs, they're in a barn on a different side. One day, I parked my car. This was very shortly after I arrived as a new employee at Guelph. I think it was about a month there. I'd been thinking about what do I want to do with my research career. I'd already been thinking about the fact that Guelph is awesome with all these animals, and I love animals. And I saw a horse laid out in the field. And all the other horses were freaking out. And I thought, oh my God. And like, there's people walking around, and I seem to be the only one noticing this. It's sort of up along a hill. So I get on the phone. I didn't know who to call. So I called the main directory, put me in touch with the people who tend to the horses in the field. There's clearly something wrong with this horse. The person on the other end tried to tell me, well, horses sleep. I'm like, yeah, I know horses sleep laying down, but this horse is not laying down, not sleeping. the other horses were too panicked. I could tell, watching the other horses, that this horse was not okay. Anyway, so I stood there long enough to make sure that help was on the way, and unfortunately it was way on the other side. I have no idea actually if this horse lived or died or what. I had to go to work and they had to do their job. But it really made me start thinking, how long had that horse been there? How come nobody noticed it? There were people walking by, probably thought, maybe it's asleep or whatever. We have technology that could have seen the minute that horse fell down or before he fell down. So it really motivated me to start thinking about what I could do, and there is a living lab at Guelph to do it in. So I started thinking about this a lot. Can ubiquitous computing detect animals in distress? And more generally, can we use the notions of smart houses and smart cities for smart farms and to help animal welfare issues? I was very excited that I was onto something. Of course, I'm a little late to the game. Lots of people are already thinking about this, which is great. You know, as a researcher interested in a field, it's really hard to start from ground zero. So there's already great work out there. And the whole field, as I have learned, is called precision livestock farming. So it even has a name that I can go now and search the literature for. But there are whole farms and systems now being deployed that connect all these things together, just like Mark Weiser's vision, where you have cows texting, the farmer who gets the data, and there's, obviously this is a little bit ridiculous, but those technologies are coming, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So over the summer, because I was so excited about this, I hired 2 URA students. One had an amazing background. She was an upper year student. She had a background in animal sciences and animal welfare. She knew way more about this stuff than I did. So I tasked her with learning even more about it and then reporting back to me. And I hired another student who was a young technologist, but he has grown up on farms. His dad's a farm manager, and he manages a very large farm, a chicken farm, it turns out, that they use these technologies. They have temperature sensors and different kind of sensors out there. And the reason why those technologies have been deployed is because the farm manager, the farm owner, is interested in welfare. Welfare also in the farm context obviously relates to economics too, but many farm owners actually care about the animals. So we're starting to see these technologies already out there. Many of them are in lab settings. We have a noseband sensor that can go on a cow, and this can measure how much they're eating. Are they eating enough? Are they having problems? A cow, if you're not familiar with cows, they chew their cud. This is a big part of, a very important part of their digestive process, and that can be monitored on their body. Every cow in the modern farm most cows now have RFID tags. They've gone from just having regular earrings, as they call them, which had a number on it, but there was always a tracking device on the farm. It was just an old-fashioned tracking device. Now they've gone to RFID tags. So wherever they go in the farm, they can be detected. So you can actually track specific animals. We're also starting to see a lot of image analysis and computer vision used to understand behavior in habitats. In particular, this project was looking at pig farms. One of the things they know about pig behavior and pig welfare is if conditions are poor, they start to become very aggressive. And apparently pigs they mount each other when they're aggressive. That's part of their aggressive behavior. And with computer vision, they will look at the length of a pig. If it's too long, it's 2 pigs. And that's how they can detect if it's actually, I mean, obviously these are inference, just like any other computer vision algorithm, you're doing some inference on behavior, but they're starting to apply a lot of technologies that have been used in computer behavior monitoring and other types of like pedestrian patterns and traffic flows into these kind of environments. So this is all well and good. I am a software person, an interface designer mostly. I'm not a techie person from the building devices perspective. So where do I fit into this, and where do I think I want to go? As we started doing all the lit survey about what's out there, I started to get a feel for where the field is. And I started to see a lot of good HCI opportunities for doing human-centered research. A lot of it obviously relates to designing for the handlers of these animals, making sure that if an animal, if some kind of distress is detectable, that it is detected, and that someone is notified, and that the information that they're given makes sense. One of the things that came up in our research, surveying this literature, was one, actually I'm down here, these systems are being deployed so that there's sensors everywhere. And there's different kinds of sensors for different kinds of things. So farmers are getting a lot of data now. And it's not necessarily in usable form or accessible form. So there's this need to manage all the notifications coming and all the data coming, and also a need to integrate and make interpretable data visualizations and make that information more accessible to the farmers. That's similar just in terms of any data that comes in from any one system. Is that understandable? Is it interpretable? Does it make sense to what the farmer knows about real behavior in the real pattern of a farm as well? So there's lots of opportunity for work in information visualization with these kinds of data. There's lots of opportunity for making mobile interfaces so that obviously farmers can go about their day-to-day jobs, and they're maybe in one location on a farm, or maybe they're off at a business meeting related to their work. Or for the farmer, work never stops. It is a 24/7, nobody else is there. I mean, obviously they've got staff as well, but the owner of the farm or the manager of the farm is ultimately responsible any time of day, so they have a life. So mobile computing becomes a huge part of the solution related to these smart farms. So these are some of the areas I'm considering going into. If you're interested or know anybody interested, I am now going to start recruiting students in this awesome area. So I would love to hear from you, or you can send your friends my way. And thank you very much.